The dust of Idaho Territory in 1882 was a currency of its own, a fine reddish powder that settled on everything, a constant tax on hope. It coated the unpainted planks of the trading post, clung to the sweat on the necks of hard-faced men, and settled in a bitter film on the tongue. It was a dust that tasted of failure. Grace Tuttle, 22 years old and 1,000 miles from a home that no longer existed, stood on a crude wooden platform, feeling the grit of it behind her teeth. The auction for unclaimed freight and livestock had ended, but she remained. She was the last lot, a mail-order bride no one had come to claim, and the broker, a man named Abernathy with a face like a clenched fist, was tired of looking at her. He had a ledger to balance, and a distaste for loose ends. He scanned the small, bored crowd of ranchers and trappers, their faces burned to leather by the sun. They had looked her over as they would a lame horse, noting the thickness of her waist, the plain, broad honesty of her face, the sturdiness of her ankles. They saw a body built for work, but not the kind they wanted to share a bed with. They saw a peasant, not a pioneer's wife. "All right, boys," Abernathy sighed, his voice scraping like a shovel on stone. "Last call. The girl from Ohio. Good teeth, strong back. A bit more substantial than the photograph, I'll grant you." A few men chuckled, a low, cruel sound. Grace stared at a crack in the floorboards, her entire being focused on that single, splintered line, a tiny abyss in a world of them. She had been on a train for 3 weeks, her small savings dwindling to nothing, her heart a cold, hard knot of dread. The man she was supposed to marry, a Mr. John Sauer, had apparently taken one look at her as she stepped onto the platform an hour ago, shaken his head, and disappeared back into the saloon. Abernathy had been furious, not for her sake, but for the inconvenience. 50 cents, the broker called out, a sneer twisting his lips. 50 cents to clear her off my books. I'll sell her contract to the mining camp foreman. They're always looking for laundry girls. The words were a physical blow. The silence that followed was worse. The dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the gloom, each a tiny, indifferent star. She was worth less than a sack of flour, less than a new axe handle. Then, a coin clinked on the crate Abernathy was using as a desk. It wasn't a 50-cent piece. It was a silver dollar, heavy and bright against the dusty wood. It spun once, then settled. A man stepped out of the shadows near the back wall, a place he'd occupied with such stillness he seemed part of the architecture. He was tall, dressed in buckskin and worn canvas, his hair the color of dark honey, and long enough to brush his collar. He had a beard, neatly trimmed, and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He smelled of pine needles and cold, clean air, a scent so alien in this dusty purgatory, it was like a promise of another world. He was the mountain, come down to the flatlands. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low and quiet, yet it cut through the murmuring of the room, silencing it completely. Abernathy stared at the dollar, then at the man. Greed warred with suspicion on his pinched face. "The price is 50 cents, Abernathy said, his voice regaining some of its swagger. The mountain man reached into his pouch and placed another silver dollar next to the first. "I'm doubling it," he said, not to Abernathy, but to the room, to the world. He wasn't haggling. He was erasing the insult. His gaze then moved for the first time to Grace. It was not a look of pity or desire or appraisal. It was a look of simple, unnerving acknowledgement. He saw her. He nodded once, a small, sharp gesture. "Come on," he said, and the words were not a command, but an invitation out of hell. The journey up the mountain was a silent one, broken only by the plodding of the man's pack mule and the whisper of the wind through the towering pines. Grace walked behind him, her worn-out boots struggling to find purchase on the steep, rocky trail. The air grew thinner, cleaner, washing the dust of the trading post from her lungs. The world of men and ledgers and 50-cent insults fell away below, swallowed by a sea of green and gray. He hadn't said another word to her since leaving the post, simply loaded her small, battered trunk onto the mule and started walking. He moved with an economy of motion she found both frightening and fascinating, his body a part of the landscape he inhabited. He carried a long rifle as if it were an extension of his arm. Every so often, he would stop, his head cocked, listening to a language she couldn't understand. The snap of a twig, the call of a distant bird, the shifting of the wind. Grace's fear, a cold, hard stone in her belly, began to slowly dissolve, replaced by a profound and aching exhaustion. She was prepared for cruelty, for demands, for the rough handling her price had suggested. She was not prepared for this quiet, this space, this utter lack of expectation. He didn't touch her. He didn't look back to see if she was keeping up. He simply set a steady pace, trusting she would follow. It was a strange and unsettling form of respect. They reached his cabin as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the jagged peaks in hues of orange and violet. The cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the evening air. It was nestled in a small meadow, sheltered by a stand of ancient firs. It looked less like a structure built upon the land, and more like something that had grown out of it. He led the mule to a small corral, unburdened it with practiced efficiency, and then turned to her. He gestured to the cabin. "Go on inside. There's stew on the hearth." He disappeared into a shed, leaving her standing alone in the twilight. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the simple leather latch of the door. This was the moment. This was where the nature of her purchase would be revealed. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. A single room, a fireplace of river stones dominating one wall, a large, rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves filled with jars, books, and neatly folded pelts. In one corner, a bed, covered with a thick bear hide. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and drying herbs. It was masculine, Spartan, but immaculately clean. A pot of stew bubbled over the low fire, sending fragrant steam into the room. He had been expecting her. The thought sent a tremor through her. He entered a few moments later, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He didn't set it by his bed. He carried it to a small alcove, almost a separate room, sectioned off by a heavy curtain. He set the trunk down. "This is yours," he said, his voice filling the small space. He pulled back the curtain to reveal a narrow cot, but it was made up with clean blankets and a pillow that looked surprisingly soft. "The door doesn't lock. From either side." He met her gaze then, and his storm-blue eyes were clear and direct. "You don't owe me anything. You can stay the winter. Come spring, the trail will be clear. You can go wherever you want. It's your choice." He dropped the curtain and walked back to the fire, ladling stew into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one on the table for her, along with a thick slice of dark bread. Then he sat and began to eat, not looking at her, not waiting for her. He was simply sharing his meal. Grace stood in the shadows of her new room, her body trembling. He hadn't bought a wife. He hadn't bought a servant. He had paid $2 to cancel a 50-cent sale. He had bought her freedom. The stew smelled of venison and wild onions. She was hungrier than she had ever been in her life. Slowly she walked to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the clinking of their spoons against wood. It was the most profound conversation she had ever had. The first days settled into a rhythm of silence and space. Grace learned the topography of her new world through observation. She learned that Eli Strand rose before the sun, the scrape of his razor and the smell of brewing coffee her alarm clock. He would leave for hours, checking his trap lines, and return with rabbit or grouse, his face impassive. He never asked what she had done in his absence. He would simply find the fire stoked, the water buckets filled, a pot of something warm simmering on the hearth. She explored the cabin with the caution of a wild thing, touching the smooth spines of his few books, running her fingers over the intricate patterns of the furs stacked in the corner. She discovered a small, meticulously tended garden behind the cabin, where he grew potatoes, carrots, and hardy greens, now covered in a careful layer of straw against the coming frost. He was a man who planned, who tended, who built. Grace, who had been raised on a farm, felt the familiar pull of the earth. She started by weeding the small herb patch she found near the door, her fingers recognizing the shapes of thyme and rosemary. He said nothing, but the next day she found a small trowel and a pair of worn leather gloves left on the porch railing. It was a conversation held through objects, a language of quiet provision. She found she could breathe on this mountain. The air was thin, but it was hers. Her trust in him was not a sudden flood, but a slow, patient thaw. It was built in the moments he did not act, the time he came upon her bathing in the creek and without a word turned his back and walked away, his rifle held loosely in his hand as he stood guard until she was finished. The nights she would wake from nightmares, her throat tight with a silent scream, and hear his steady breathing from the other side of the room, a rhythmic, reassuring presence in the dark. He never tried to comfort her with words she didn't want to hear. His comfort was his consistency. He was as reliable as the sunrise, as solid as the mountain they lived on. One afternoon, a shadow fell over the cabin and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that vibrated in her bones. An early, vicious snowstorm descended without warning, blanketing the world in a blinding sheet of white. Eli, who had been caught out checking a distant line of traps, stumbled in hours later, his beard caked with ice, his face a raw, angry red. He was shivering violently, his hands too numb to unbutton his coat. Grace, without a thought, moved to help him. Her fingers fumbled with the frozen buttons, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. He was the anchor of her world. She could not imagine it without him. She stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped him in the thickest blankets, and pushed him into the chair closest to the fire. She brewed the strongest, hottest coffee she could, lacing it with the small bit of whiskey he kept on a high shelf. She rubbed his hands and feet until the feeling began to return, her touch gentle but firm. He watched her through it all, his usually guarded eyes wide with a mixture of pain and something she couldn't name. It looked like surprise. He had rescued her from the dust, but in the heart of the storm, she was the one keeping the fire alive. The storm passed, leaving the world pristine and silent, draped in a thick blanket of white. The pace of their lives slowed even further, dictated by the deep snow and the shrinking daylight. It was during this enforced intimacy that Grace began to reveal the gifts she carried within her. One of his sled dogs, a young husky named Blue, fell ill, refusing food and whining pitifully in his straw bed. Eli had tried everything he knew, but the dog only grew weaker. Grace watched for a day, her expression thoughtful. On the second morning, she bundled herself up and disappeared into the snow-covered woods. Eli was worried. The silent forest held its own dangers, but something in the set of her jaw stopped him from calling her back. She returned hours later, her cheeks flushed with cold, her basket filled with frozen berries, strips of bark, and a peculiar-looking root. She spent the afternoon boiling them down into a dark, fragrant mash. She approached the sick dog, who barely had the strength to lift his head. She spoke to it in a low, crooning voice, a language of pure comfort, and spooned the mixture into its mouth. Eli watched, skeptical but silent. By the next morning, Blue was on his feet, wagging his tail and licking Grace's hand. Eli stared, first at the dog, then at her. "My grandmother was an herbalist," she said, the words soft in the quiet cabin. "She taught me things." His respect, already a sturdy sapling, grew another ring. He began to see that her strength was not just in her back, but in her hands, her eyes, her memory. Her knowledge wasn't confined to healing. She had a sense for the world that went beyond logic. She could read the clouds, taste the shifts in the wind, and predict the weather with an accuracy that unnerved him. "The snow will be heavy tomorrow," she'd say, looking at the way the smoke curled from the chimney. "The deer will move down to the lower valley." And she would be right. He started consulting her before he set out, showing her his maps, pointing to the ridges and gullies. She would trace a line with her finger, her touch light on the worn paper. "The ice will be thin here," she'd murmur, "but the rabbits will be sheltering in this thicket." He stopped seeing her as the woman from the auction block, the fat one no one wanted. He saw a partner, a mind as sharp and resilient as any trapper's. He saw a woman who was as much a part of the mountain as he was. His initial act of pity had been a simple, moral reflex. But now, watching her mend a tear in his buckskin shirt, with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, he felt a different emotion stirring, something deeper and more complex. It was a form of wonder. He had bought her for $2, thinking he was offering her a temporary sanctuary. He was beginning to realize that she was the one building a home, right here in the heart of his solitude. The blizzard came in the 3rd month, a true monster of a storm that sealed the cabin off from the world for a week. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow against the door until it reached the roofline. Inside, the world shrank to the circle of firelight. The silence, once a space between them, was now a shared vessel, full of unspoken thoughts. On the 3rd night, the fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and the only sound was the howling of the wind and the steady scratch of Eli's knife against a piece of pine. He was carving a small bird, its wings outstretched. Grace sat across from him, mending a sock, her needle moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The quiet felt different tonight, charged with a new weight. "My father carved birds," she said, her voice barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. It was the first time she had offered a piece of her past without being asked. Eli stopped carving. He placed the half-finished bird on the hearth and gave her his full attention. The firelight flickered in his eyes. He didn't press, he simply waited. The silence was his invitation. Encouraged by his patient stillness, she continued. "We had a farm in Ohio. It wasn't large, but it was ours. My mother's garden was famous in the county. People said she could make a dead stick bloom." A faint smile touched her lips, a ghost of a forgotten joy. "Then the blight came for the wheat, 2 years running. The bank took the farm. My father, he couldn't bear it. He walked into the barn one morning and didn't walk out." The words were flat, delivered without emotion, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "My mother faded after that. She died of a cough that winter, but I think she really died of a broken heart. The church ladies said I was too plain to find a husband locally. They collected money to send me west. They called it a Christian kindness." She looked down at her hands, at the needle she still held. "The journey was long. The man who was supposed to meet me, Mr. Sauer, he sent a photograph. He looked kind." She finally looked up, and her eyes, clear and dark, met his. "He wasn't." Eli felt a cold, hard anger settle in his chest, an anger on her behalf. He had seen men like Sauer his whole life, men who measured worth in acres and appearance. He reached for a log and placed it carefully on the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The new flames lit his face, revealing the deep lines etched around his eyes. "I had a family once," he said, his own voice rough. He had not spoken their names aloud in 5 years. "My wife Sarah, and our boy Daniel. He was 4, had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees." He picked up the wooden bird again, his thumb stroking its smooth surface. "We had a cabin down in the valley, closer to town. Sarah liked people. She said the mountains were too quiet." He paused, the memory a sharp, physical pain. Mountain fever took them, both of them, in 3 days. "I was out on a long hunt, trying to get a big enough haul of pelts to see us through a hard winter. By the time I got back, the doctor had already been and gone. Said there was nothing to be done." He stared into the fire, but he wasn't seeing the flames. He was seeing a small, lonely gravesite marked by 2 wooden crosses. "I should have been here. I should have stayed closer. The doctor might have come sooner if I'd been here to fetch him faster. Or maybe I could have done something." He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. "I buried them and came up here. The quiet she hated. It was the only thing I wanted." He placed the finished bird in her hand. Its wooden wings were smooth and perfect. They sat in the warmth of the fire, the storm raging outside. 2 solitary souls who had just handed each other the broken pieces of their pasts. They did not try to fix each other. They simply held the pieces and, in the shared weight, found a strange and unexpected comfort. Spring arrived not as a gentle thaw, but as a torrent. The snow melted with a sudden, furious rush, turning the creeks into roaring rivers and the mountain trails into treacherous streams of mud. The world, which had been silent and white, was now loud with the sound of running water and bursting with the violent green of new life. With the clearing of the trails came the world of men. Grace saw him first, a dark figure on horseback picking his way up the muddy path below the cabin. It was Abernathy, the broker. He was not alone. 2 other men, their faces hard and unfamiliar, rode with him. A cold dread, a feeling she had almost forgotten, seized her. She ran into the cabin where Eli was oiling his rifle. "He's here," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "The broker." Eli's face hardened. He didn't seem surprised. He simply finished wiping down the rifle barrel, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stood up and took his hat from a peg by the door. "Stay inside," he said. It was not a suggestion. He met them in the meadow in front of the cabin. He stood with the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, not aiming it, but making its presence known. Abernathy reined in his horse a few feet away, a smug, proprietary look on his face. "Strand," he said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near his horse's hooves. "I've come for my property. Your little arrangement is over." Eli's expression didn't change. His eyes, the color of winter ice, were fixed on the broker. "She's not property," Abernathy laughed, a humorless bark. "I have a contract, an indenture agreement for one Grace Tuttle signed by the Ladies' Aid Society of Putnam County, Ohio. She failed to meet the terms of her bridal contract with Mr. Sauer, which means she reverts to me, the agent, to be reassigned for labor to recoup my expenses. You interfered with a legal transaction. You sold a human being for 50 cents, Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. There's nothing legal about that. One of Abernathy's hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. Eli's gaze flickered to the man and held him there, pinned by the sheer, cold force of his will. The man's hand dropped. Abernathy's face flushed with anger. She belongs in the mining camp laundry, not playing house with some crazy mountain man. I'm here to take her back, by force if necessary. Eli took one step forward. The movement was slight, but it held a world of menace. He wasn't a tall man by the standards of the flatlands, But up here, on his own ground, he seemed to draw power from the very stones beneath his feet. He looked past Abernathy, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air, intended for the two men who were being paid to stand with him. "Her name is Grace," he said, his voice low and firm, each word a carefully placed stone. "She has healed my dog. She has kept my fire. She knows which roots to eat and which will kill you. She has survived a winter on this mountain. She is more of a pioneer than any of you will ever be. This is her home now." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "The trail down the mountain is that way. I suggest you take it." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the rushing of the creek and the nervous stamp of a horse. Abernathy looked at his hired men, but they refused to meet his eyes. They had heard the truth in Eli's words. They had seen the certainty in his eyes. There was no money in the world that could pay a man to die for a 50-cent contract. Cursing, Abernathy wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Strand," he shouted over his shoulder. "I'll be back with the law." Eli watched them retreat down the trail until they were swallowed by the trees. He did not lower the rifle until they were long gone. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin, where Grace stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. They were not tears of fear, but of something else entirely. The threat of Abernathy's return hung in the air, a persistent shadow in their newfound peace. Eli grew more watchful, his rifle never far from his hand. Grace found herself starting at every unfamiliar sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of a hawk. The freedom of the mountain, once a source of solace, now felt like a vulnerability. They were isolated, exposed. The world of contracts and laws, which had seemed so distant, was climbing the trail toward them. One evening, as Eli was sharpening his axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape filling the quiet cabin, Grace walked over to him. She was holding something in her closed fist. She opened her hand. On her palm lay a small, tarnished coin. It was a 50-cent piece, its edges worn smooth. "This is what he paid for me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The man at the mining camp. Abernathy threw it at me. I've kept it." She had kept it as a brand, a reminder of her worthlessness in the eyes of the world. It was a cold, heavy weight in her pocket, a secret shame she carried everywhere. Now, in the warm light of the cabin, it looked small and pitiful. Eli stopped his work. He looked at the coin, then at her face. He saw the pain and humiliation she had carried all these months, condensed into that single piece of metal. He wiped his hands on his trousers, stood up, and took the coin from her. His fingers were warm against her cold palm. "Then it's time to unmake it," he said simply. He led her outside, to the small forge he used for mending traps and shaping tools. He stoked the coals of the fire, his movements sure and steady, pumping the bellows until the embers glowed with a fierce orange heat. He didn't ask her if this was what she wanted. He knew. He held the coin with a pair of long tongs and pushed it into the heart of the fire. They stood together and watched. At first the coin resisted, its stamped image of liberty holding against the heat. But then the edges began to soften. The metal glowed red, then orange, then a brilliant liquid yellow. The face, the letters, the date, all the markers of its value in the world of men, melted away, dissolving into a shapeless, incandescent tear. Eli pulled the glowing metal from the fire. It was no longer a coin. It was just a lump of hot, raw silver, all its history burned away. He plunged it into a bucket of water, and it hissed, a final, angry sigh. The steam rose into the cool night air. He took the cooled, misshapen lump and handed it to her. It was heavy, but it was just metal now. It had no story, it had no power over her. "Let's bury it," she said. Together they dug a small hole near the herb garden. the place where she had first begun to put down her own roots. She dropped the silver lump in. They covered it with dark, rich earth. It was a funeral and a baptism. She was no longer the 50-cent woman. She was Grace. That night, something shifted irrevocably between them. The destruction of the coin had been more than a symbolic act. It was a severing of the final tie to her past, and a forging of a new bond between them. The space in the cabin no longer felt like his, with her as a guest. It felt like theirs. The next day, while he was out checking the perimeter, Grace did something she had never dared to do before. She rearranged the main room. She moved the table so it caught the morning light. She took the most beautiful of the pelts, a soft, silver-tipped fox fur, and draped it over the back of her chair. She went out and gathered a small bouquet of purple lupine and yellow mountain daisies and placed them in a water glass on the table. It was a small change, but it was an act of claiming, an assertion of her presence. When Eli returned at dusk, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The wildflowers on the table, the warm, inviting light. He looked at Grace, who stood by the hearth, her heart pounding, waiting for his reaction. He said nothing. He simply removed his hat, hung his rifle on its peg, and walked to the table. He touched one of the lupine blossoms with a calloused finger, a gesture of incredible gentleness. He looked up at her, and the storm blue of his eyes was clear and deep, all the guards down for the first time. The silence stretched, but it was a comfortable wait now, a shared breath. He had given her a room, a roof, a choice. But she had given him something he thought he had lost forever. A home. The words, when they came, were as simple and solid as the mountain itself. "Stay, Grace," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "Not just for the winter, not until spring. Stay with me." It was not a question. It was a plea, a statement of fact. His world was better with her in it. She didn't answer with words. She walked across the wooden floor, the sound of her footsteps the only noise in the room. She stood before him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She reached out, took his large, work-roughened hand, and lifted it. She didn't hold it or kiss it. She placed it flat against her chest, directly over her heart. She held it there, her own hand covering his, letting him feel the strong, steady beat of her life against his palm. "I am home," she said. And with that, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of pent-up desire. It was a kiss of reverence, of recognition. It tasted of wood smoke and wildflowers, and the profound, quiet certainty of two lost souls finding their way to the same small patch of earth. Their peace, hard-won and precious, lasted for 2 weeks. It was a golden time, a quiet interlude where they learned the rhythms of each other's bodies as they had learned the rhythms of the mountain. They spoke more, sharing small stories and observations, their conversations weaving a tapestry of shared life. But the shadow of Abernathy's threat remained. One morning, as the mist was still clinging to the valley floor, Eli's dogs began to bark, a frantic, aggressive sound. Eli was instantly alert. He grabbed his rifle and went to the door, Grace close behind him. It wasn't just Abernathy this time. The broker rode at the front, but behind him was another man, wearing a dusty coat and a tin star. A marshal. And with them were 4 deputized men from the town, their faces a mixture of grim duty and nervous excitement. "Eli Strand," the marshal called out, his voice carrying the weight of the law. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for harboring a runaway indentured servant and for assault on a federal agent." Abernathy smirked from his horse. He had found the one power greater than a mountain man's will, a piece of paper. "It's a lie. Grace whispered, her hand clutching Eli's arm. You have to go, Eli said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes never leaving the men below. Out the back, follow the creek up to the high ridge. There's an old line cabin there. I'll meet you. No, she said, her grip tightening. I'm not leaving you. Grace, this is not a discussion. Go, now! He pushed her toward the back of the cabin, but as she hesitated, a shot rang out. A bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Eli's head. Abernathy, in his eagerness, had fired. That was all the excuse the marshal's men needed. Gunfire erupted, a terrifying cacophony that shattered the mountain's silence. Eli shoved Grace to the floor and returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back, to buy her time. He moved from the window to the door, a phantom in the smoke-filled cabin, his rifle speaking in sharp, definitive bursts. Another bullet tore through the wall, catching him high in the left shoulder. He grunted in pain, stumbling back, the rifle clattering to the floor. Blood, dark and shocking, bloomed across his shirt. Grace screamed his name. In that moment, the timid, fearful woman who had stepped off the train in Idaho died forever. She saw the man who had saved her, the man who had given her back her name, bleeding on the floor of their home. A fierce, cold rage she didn't know she possessed rose up in her. She didn't run out the back. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the hearth and scrambled out the small root-cellar hatch at the rear of the cabin, hidden by a bearskin rug. She was not running away. She was flanking them. She knew this part of the mountain better than any of them. She knew the game trails, the rock falls, the treacherous footing. While they were focused on the front of the cabin, she scrambled up the steep embankment behind it, her lungs burning, her feet finding purchase in the familiar earth. Above the trail where the marshal and his men had left their horses, the mountain was steep, a wall of loose rock and scree held in place by little more than gravity and stubborn roots. She had walked past it 100 times, noting its instability. Eli had warned her about it. Now, it was their salvation. With a strength born of desperation, she began to heave at the largest, most precariously balanced boulder at the top of the scree field. It resisted, a dead, immovable weight. She screamed with effort, her muscles straining, tears of fury and fear blurring her vision. She put her back into it, using her legs, her entire body, and finally, with a groan of protesting rock, the boulder shifted. It teetered for a heart-stopping moment, then plunged downward, taking a cascade of smaller rocks and dirt with it. The rockslide was not massive, but it was loud and terrifying. It roared down the mountainside, a river of stone, and crashed across the trail, completely blocking the path and sending the tethered horses into a panic. The men below yelled in alarm, their attention torn from the cabin. She had bought them time. She scrambled back down to the cabin, her hands and knees raw. Eli was on his feet, leaning against the wall, his face pale, a pistol in his good hand. "The horses!" he gasped. She didn't need to be told twice. She helped him out the back, his arm draped over her shoulders, his weight a heavy, grounding presence. She half-carried, half-dragged him to the corral, saddled his horse with frantic, fumbling hands, and somehow got him into the saddle. She untied her own mare, and taking the reins of both, led them not down the mountain, but up, deeper into the wilderness, toward the hidden sanctuary of the high ridge. The rescued had become the rescuer. A year bled into the next, measured not by calendars, but by the turning of seasons. The Highline cabin, once a forgotten outpost for a long hunt, became their world. It was smaller than the first, rougher, but it was a fortress, nestled in a high alpine bowl accessible only by a single hidden trail. Here, the world of men, contracts, and warrants could not reach them. The law had likely given them up for dead, another pair of souls claimed by the unforgiving wilderness. Eli's shoulder had healed, though a deep, puckered scar remained. and it ached with a dull fire when the weather turned cold. It was a constant reminder of the price of their peace. He could no longer draw a heavy bow or swing an axe for long, but his hands were still sure, his eyes still sharp. He taught Grace everything he knew: how to read the tracks of a snowshoe hare, how to call a bull moose, how to find her way by the stars. And she, in turn, taught him things he had forgotten: how to laugh, how to find joy in small things, how to believe in a future. She planted a garden in the thin, rocky soil, coaxing life from the high-altitude earth with a patience that bordered on magic. The cabin, once a rough shelter, bloomed under her touch, filled with the scent of drying herbs and the warmth of a well-tended fire. Now, as the first snows of their second winter together began to dust the peaks, a different kind of peace settled over them, one deeper and more profound than mere survival. Grace sat in a rocking chair Eli had made for her, its runners smooth and even on the plank floor. The late afternoon sun, a pale gold, streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In her hands, she was mending a tiny shirt, no bigger than her two hands put together. Her own body, once a source of shame and derision, was now a vessel of creation, her belly swollen with the promise of new life. Eli sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical movements a meditation. He was not looking at the gun. He was watching her. He watched the way the light caught the auburn strands in her brown hair, the serene concentration on her face, the gentle curve of her cheek. He had once believed his heart was a barren place, a landscape of grief and guilt. But this woman, this quiet, steady, miraculous woman, had walked into his winter and planted a garden. She had shown him that a life could be rebuilt, that a heart could heal, that love could grow in the stoniest of soil. He set the rifle aside, the task forgotten. He crossed the small room and knelt before her, his knees creaking in the quiet. He didn't speak. He simply laid his hand on her belly, his palm spread wide over the taut curve of her womb. His hand was large, calloused, scarred by a hard life, but his touch was unbelievably gentle. He closed his eyes, a look of awe on his face. And then he felt it. A tiny, insistent flutter from within, a kick, the first stirrings of the new life they had made together. His eyes snapped open and met hers. They were filled with tears. A life bought for 50 cents had become priceless. A freedom given as a gift had been returned as a love that was absolute. Here, on the roof of the world, far from the judgments of men, a mountain man and the woman no one wanted had found everything. They had found that true sanctuary was not a place on a map, but a choice freely made to stand together against the storm, and that the only ground fertile enough for a soul to truly grow is the ground of being chosen.